a mother's hope. There was an old woman in a small village. Her name was Mary. She lived in a tiny house near a big oak tree. The house had small windows, a wooden door, and a garden full of flowers. Every morning she sat by the window and looked at the road. She waited. She waited for 20 years. Her hands rested on her lap, her eyes fixed on the dusty path. She watched the people pass by, children running, men carrying wood, women talking in soft voices. But she was not looking for them. She was looking for someone else. Mary had a son. His name was John. He had brown hair and bright eyes. He was kind and strong. When he was a boy, he loved to run through the fields and climb the big oak tree. He laughed loudly and played with the village children. But one day, everything changed. John went to war. The village was silent when he left. People stood outside their homes and watched him go. Some waved, some whispered prayers. Mary held his hands tightly. "Come back soon, my son," she said. John smiled. "I will, Mother," he answered. Then he turned and walked away. The years passed. The seasons changed. The leaves turned yellow and fell. The cold winds came, and the snow covered the village. In spring, the flowers bloomed again, and the birds sang. The world moved forward, but Mary did not. She stayed the same. She sat by the window. She watched the road. She waited. People told her, "John is gone." They said, "He will not return." But Mary shook her head. "He will come home," she said. She cooked dinner for two. She placed an extra chair at the table. She never locked the door at night. "John will need to come in," she whispered. The villagers felt sorry for her. They spoke about her in hushed voices. "Poor Mary," they said. "She does not understand." But Mary did understand. She knew what they thought. Still, she did not stop waiting. She woke up every morning with hope. She sat by the window, her hands folded, her heart steady. She counted the days, the months, the years. She never missed a single sunset. Then, one afternoon, something happened. A man walked down the road. He was tall, his hair was grey, his face was tired, his clothes were old and dusty. He walked slowly, his steps heavy. He looked at Mary's house. His eyes were soft. He stopped in front of the gate and stood there for a long time. Mary stood up. Her hands shook. Her heart beat fast. She took a deep breath. She stepped toward the door. The man lifted his head. His lips parted as if to speak. The air was still. The village was quiet. Mary stood at the door. The man stood at the gate. The wind moved the leaves. The sky was grey. The village was quiet. For a moment, time stopped. Mary's hands trembled. Her heart beat fast. She looked at the man's face. His eyes were deep and dark. There was something familiar in them, something she had seen before. The man opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He lowered his head and took a step forward. Mary's breath was slow and careful. She felt the weight of 20 years in her chest. She had dreamed of this moment so many times. She had imagined John walking down the road, smiling, calling her name, but now this man stood before her, older, different, tired. She wanted to speak, but her voice was gone. She wanted to move, but her feet stayed still. The man took another step. His hands were rough, his clothes covered in dust. He was a traveller, a man who had seen too much of the world, but there was something else, something she could not yet name. The villagers watched from their homes. Some peeked through their windows, others stood at their doors. They whispered among themselves. "Who is he?" they asked. "Why is Mary looking at him like that?" The village had not seen a stranger in a long time. Most travellers passed through quickly, never stopping. But this man stood still. He did not move. He did not speak. He just looked at Mary with quiet, patient eyes. Mary stepped forward. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Who are you?" she asked. The man lifted his head. He opened his mouth, but then closed it again. His hands curled into fists, then relaxed. He took a deep breath. "I am John," he said. His voice was low and careful. The words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Mary's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, her mind racing. Could it be true? Could this tired, grey-haired man be her son? The villagers gasped. Some shook their heads. Others whispered, "It cannot be." They had seen John leave as a young man. They remembered his bright eyes, his strong arms, his quick smile. This man was different. He was older, thinner, worn by time. But Mary did not listen to them. She did not look away. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. The man stood still, waiting. His hands were open, his shoulders tense. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He just stood there, letting Mary look at him, letting her decide. The air was thick with silence. The world felt smaller, as if only the two of them existed. Mary reached out. Her fingers brushed his arm. The fabric of his coat was rough, like it had seen many years of travel. Her hand trembled, but she did not pull away. She felt his warmth, his presence. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she spoke, her voice stronger now. Mary's fingers rested on the man's sleeve. The fabric was rough and worn. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked into his face, searching for the boy she had lost. The man did not move. He stood still, his breath slow, his hands open at his sides. The village was silent. The wind had stopped. Even the birds seemed to hold their voices. The whole world was waiting. Mary swallowed hard. "John," she whispered. The name felt both familiar and strange. The man nodded, his eyes filled with something deep, something heavy. Tears filled Mary's eyes, but she did not cry. She had waited too long for this moment. She had dreamed of it for years. Now it was real, but it was not how she had imagined. John was different. His shoulders were broad, his skin rough from years of sun and wind. His hair was no longer dark. His hands were not the hands of a young man. But his eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes she had seen every day in her memories. She took a deep breath and stepped back. "You were gone for so long," she said. Her voice was steady, but inside her heart was unsteady, unsure. John's lips parted as if to speak, but he hesitated. He looked down at his hands, at the dust on his clothes. He looked past Mary, at the little house, at the big oak tree that still stood tall. His chest rose and fell with a deep sigh. "I tried to come back," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost broken, "but the road was long, and I was not the same." His words hung in the air like heavy stones. The villagers listened in silence. Some still doubted. Others watched Mary, waiting for her to decide. Was this truly John? Could a son return after so many years and still be the same? Mary reached for the door. Her fingers curled around the handle. She pushed it open, stepping aside. The warm light of the house spilled onto the cold ground. The air smelled of bread, of home. She did not speak. She did not ask any more questions. Instead, she looked at John one last time, then nodded toward the open door. An invitation, a welcome, a test. The villagers held their breath. John stood still for a moment, then took a step forward, one step closer to home. John stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked under his weight. The house smelled the same, warm bread, old wood, a faint scent of flowers. His eyes moved slowly across the room. The small table stood in the centre. 2 plates were set, just like before. A chair waited, empty, waiting for him. His throat tightened. It felt like stepping into a memory. Mary watched him carefully. She stood by the door, her hands clasped together. Her heart was full of questions, but she did not speak. She had waited too long for this moment. Words could come later. For now, she only watched. She saw the way John's fingers brushed the table, the way his shoulders trembled slightly. He was remembering. John reached for the chair and pulled it back. He sat down slowly, his hands resting on his knees. The house felt smaller than he remembered. Or maybe he had grown too big for it. He looked up at Mary. His eyes were tired, but they held something else, something that had not faded with time. Mary turned toward the kitchen. She moved with quiet purpose. She poured soup into a bowl, placed bread on a plate. Her hands were steady, but her breath was not. She carried the food to the table and set it down in front of John. Then she sat across from him. The candle on the table flickered. Shadows danced on the walls. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The village outside was silent. No whispers, no footsteps, only the sound of the wind. Mary lifted her spoon and took a slow sip. John did the same. The warmth spread through him. It tasted like home. It tasted like a time he thought he had lost. John ate slowly. Each bite was careful, each sip of soup measured. The warmth filled his chest, but his hands still felt cold. His fingers curled around the spoon as if holding on to something fragile. The room was quiet except for the soft clink of metal against the bowl. He glanced at Mary. She ate without speaking, her eyes fixed on the table. But he knew she was watching, waiting. Mary's heart was steady, but her mind was full. She had dreamed of this moment for 20 years. Now John was here, sitting at her table, eating the food she had prepared. But he was not the same. His shoulders were heavier, his eyes carried shadows. She wanted to ask him 100 questions, but she was afraid of the answers. Instead, she refilled his bowl, placed more bread on his plate, and waited. John felt the weight of her silence. He swallowed hard. "You never stopped waiting," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. Mary looked up. She met his eyes, searching for something familiar. "No," she said. Her hands rested on the table, fingers slightly curled. "I knew you would come back." John let out a slow breath. He looked around the small house, at the wooden walls, at the candle flickering between them. Everything was the same, yet different. He touched the edge of the table, tracing the worn wood with his fingers. "It doesn't feel real," he murmured. His voice was almost lost in the quiet. Mary's hands tightened. She had spent years imagining what she would say when this day came. But now, sitting across from her son, words felt small. "You are home," she said simply. The words were soft but strong. They hung in the air between them, wrapping around the space that time had created. John lowered his head. He pressed his hands together, as if holding on to the moment. "I wanted to come sooner," he admitted. His voice cracked slightly. "But I was afraid I had no home to return to." The confession was heavy. It settled into the quiet, making the room feel smaller. Mary reached across the table. Her fingers brushed against his. His hands were rough, calloused, shaped by years of hardship. But they were warm. She held them for a moment, her touch light but certain. "You were always my son," she whispered, "and this was always your home." John looked up. His eyes shone with something unspoken. The shadows in them shifted, just a little. He nodded, not trusting his voice. He picked up the bread, tore off a piece, and ate. It tasted like the past. It tasted like belonging. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the small room. John sat still, his hands resting on the table, his fingers lightly touching the worn wood. The air was thick with quiet, the kind that held meaning, the kind that did not need to be broken. He looked up at Mary. Her eyes held no doubt, no hesitation, only knowing, only love. Mary took a slow breath. For years she had waited, holding on to hope when others told her to let go. Now the waiting was over. Her son was here, not as she had imagined, not as he had been, but here. That was enough. She reached for the candle, pulling it closer, letting the light chase away the shadows between them. "You are home," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. John swallowed. The words settled deep inside him. Home. He had carried that word in his heart for years, never knowing if he would say it again. He lowered his gaze, exhaling slowly. "I am," he said. The words felt strange yet right, a truth he had longed to believe. Mary stood, moving toward the cupboard. She took out a folded blanket, the same one she had kept all these years. She walked back to him and placed it gently over his shoulders. Her hands lingered for a moment, warm and certain. "Rest now," she whispered. "You are safe." John did not speak. He only nodded, gripping the edges of the blanket, holding on to its warmth. His shoulders relaxed. His breath slowed. The past no longer pressed so heavily on him. The night stretched on, calm and quiet. And for the first time in 20 years, John did not feel lost. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The village slept in silence. And in a small house by the old oak tree, a mother and her son sat together in the light, in the warmth, in the place where love had waited.